Convener, Daryl Cameron. I'm an assistant professor in psychology here at Penn State. I'm also a research associate in the Rock Ethics Institute. If you've been joining us this week, you'll have seen on Monday, we had Paul Conway give a talk on moral dilemmas. On Tuesday, yesterday, David DeSteno from Northeastern came and gave a talk on social emotions and self-control. And now today, Dr. Abigail Marsh is visiting to talk about the altruistic brain. I wanted to give a quick reminder for those of you who were intrigued by the first two talks and today's talk. We are also doing a panel later today on Zoom on empathy and the response to the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. It will involve myself as moderator, Dr. Marsh, DeSteno, Conway, and also Michael Poulin from SUNY Buffalo, who was one of last year's Expanding Empathy speakers. And so I encourage you to tune in if you find that interesting a little bit later. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Marsh. She is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology in the Interdisciplinary Neuroscience program at Georgetown University. She got her PhD from Harvard and did a postdoc at the National Institute of Mental Health. She directs the Laboratory on Social and Affective Neuroscience and is the president of the Society for the Social and Affective Neuroscience Society, I should say. So she's the president of that organization. She uses a combination of fMRI and behavioral approaches to understand questions about how people think and feel about pro-social situations. Why do people help each other? What prevents us from harming them? Her work has received a number of awards and prizes. She's been funded by the National Science Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and it has received the White Memorial Award for Translational Research from the National Institute of Mental Health and the Cosarelli Prize for Scientific Excellence and Originality from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's, I think, great that Dr. Marsh has been willing to join us here today. And I also want to thank the Rock Ethics staff, David Price, who's directing, Betsy Van Noy and Tony Aman, also our folks in Department of Psychology, Health and Human Development, and so forth. So without further ado, pleased to introduce Dr. Marsh on the altruistic brain.
Thank you so much, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be able to speak about this topic today, despite the fact I can't be doing it in person. So I would like to start today with an image that people may have seen a few months back. It feels like years, I know, but I think it was only a few months ago. You may have seen it, you may not have. The picture was taken in New York City shortly after a 25-year-old woman crossed the street on the Lower East Side in New York when this SUV that you see turned the corner and hit her, and then dragged her and then rolled over her, pinning her legs under its rear tires. And you can just see her in this image here, just a little bit of her. I don't know if you know what happened next, you may. More than a dozen strangers ended up rushing to her rescue, rocking and eventually lifting the car until she was freed. And luckily she was nearly totally uninjured thanks to their quick responding. Almost as though these strangers had read the words of Senator Cory Booker, who is himself a heroic rescuer, who was asked, just driving in our car, most of us see problems and challenges. And the question is, are you going to be someone who just keeps going? And this quote resonates with me personally, as my life was also once saved by a stranger who didn't just keep going. There's a longer story, but the short story is that I was driving down this freeway in Tacoma, Washington when I was 19. And my car spun out after I swerved to avoid a dog, which left me stranded in the fast lane of the freeway on an overpass at midnight in a car with a dead engine. Turned out that spinning around in a freeway sometimes makes your engine die. And I don't know how long I sat there, sure that I was about to die as well, until a stranger appeared out of nowhere, got my car up and running again, and then got me back to safety, and then disappeared without ever even telling me his name. And I know that I'm here today because that man didn't just keep going. And the question I've been trying to understand more or less since then is why? What made that man stop? What makes any of us change course from whatever road we're heading down to engage in behaviors that help the people around us, to engage in altruism instead of just keeping going? And obviously, this is a question that has puzzled people for a long time, at least going back to Charles Darwin. Here's my obligatory Darwin picture. Likely further, Because many people have come to the conclusion that maybe altruists shouldn't exist at all. Just to paraphrase this quote, Darwin surmised, how could altruism continue to exist when altruistic people by necessity risk their own welfare to help others who often are not genetically related to them, which seems like it should take their children out of the population. So the most common explanation for altruism for quite some time scientifically was that, okay, we know that acts of altruism may sometimes occur, but only because it's motivated by some important proximal selfish goal, like, for example, reputation. The problem is that these conjectures can't easily accommodate altruism that incurs real risks or costs that exceed the value of those proximal benefits. Again, think of my roadside rescuer, right? What possible gain could he have expected that would have compensated for the extreme risk that he was taking to his own life? So to the rescue came the 20th century biologists who study species like ground squirrels and vampire bats, who show that costly altruism can indeed emerge when it's driven by ultimate selfish goals like helping one's genetic kin or reciprocity, which in some cases will outweigh the short-term cost of altruism. But even these still can't accommodate costly altruism for strangers who you might never see again. Reciprocity and kin selection are all about helping members of your family or members of your group. And we know that costly altruism for strangers exists. So for example, Stanley Milgram, don't usually think of the Milgram studies as showing anything about compassion and altruism, but he did find that when the learner and the experimenter were in equally close proximity to the teacher, a majority of subjects ultimately refused to administer shocks to a stranger, which suggests that altruistic motivation is actually stronger than obedience. And he sort of thought of the competing motivations of the obedience to authority and compassion for an innocent stranger as sort of opposing fields of force. And when those fields are in equally close proximity to you, the desire to avoid hurting a stranger actually wins out. You may be less familiar with the work of Dan Batson, but his body of work demonstrates that people will even volunteer to take shocks on behalf of a stranger. In fact, a paper just came out, I believe last week, showing something similar. And they'll do this even when it would be easy to escape, to do something other than take the shocks, to just keep on going, if they're induced to empathize, or perhaps you could say prevented from empathizing. And recent work suggests that empathy in response to other people's distress or need is actually the default response. So although Batson developed his empathy altruism hypothesis based on these findings, one thing I should emphasize is that really what Batson was measuring in the subjects who helped is what usually people now call sympathy or compassion, or my preferred term, because it applies equally well to humans and non-human animals, is care, right? Care, it means you care about somebody's welfare other than your own. Now, that said, some laboratory data from researchers like Cialdini suggest that altruism can potentially be better explained in terms of proximate selfish motives like mood enhancement. And there's lots of work from scientists like Lara Aikman and Liz Dunn showing that helping other people does in fact enhance your mood. This is a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we feel good when we help other people. But the problem is that some people look at this research and contend that it means that altruism is never really driven by altruistic motivation or care because of its mood enhancing ability. And I think this in part reflects the inherent shortcomings of studying altruism in the lab. And I think that the research that I've done in real world altruists proves otherwise, but let's see if you agree. So the first important observation relevant to this question is one that's been obvious in the data of Milgram and Batson and Cialdini and anybody else who's ever studied altruism, which is how variable altruism is. In any given condition, there is tons of variation among participants. And arguably, Milgram and Batson and Cialdini did not primarily focus on variation because they were social psychologists, right? They believe in the power of the situation. But in reality, there's a huge component of personality, of individual differences that pop up in these studies. Now, there was some effort to explain away individual variation as just noise. And this was in part because it's been very difficult to identify reliable predictors of why people vary in their altruistic behavior within a situation. And there are variables that maybe make a little difference around the edges, like gender and self-reported empathy and emotion processing style. But in general, they don't seem to explain very much about individual variation in altruism. So my dissertation work was aimed at trying to find variables that reliably predict individual variation in altruism in the laboratory. For one of these studies, we replicated Dan Batson's research, where people are given the opportunity to help a stranger. And we found, as Batson did, that instructing participants to empathize with a stranger who they hear or see who's in distress does increase their donations of time, for example, that they pledged to help her out, although we didn't find it increased how much money they were willing to donate. But what we found across this study and 2 additional studies is that the best predictor of altruism in the lab, of individual variation, was actually a form of empathic accuracy, which was the ability to recognize fearful facial expressions that we showed in an entirely different task as part of the same battery, and only fearful facial expressions, right? So it's not your empathic accuracy in general, it's just your ability to recognize fearful expressions in this task over here, predict how altruistic you are in some totally separate task that we administer later. Now, if you feel like it's not intuitively obvious why these 2 things would be connected, you're not alone. These findings were actually included in a paper that was published a little later about the most unintuitive empirical observations of 2007. And because I was, early in my postdoc career when this paper came out, I was like, hey, they cited me. But I don't know if it's the world's biggest compliment for your findings to be considered the most unintuitive. That said, I don't totally agree that they're the most unintuitive. I think they become a lot more intuitive if you consider the flip side of this question, which is why don't some people help? And this is a question at the heart of much research on psychopathy. And this is the disorder that I started studying after I finished my PhD, because I realized in doing the literature review for my dissertation that there was this really important intrinsic link between all of the research that I had been doing and the body of literature that existed on psychopathy. Because there's a lot of misinformation out there about psychopathy, I just want to give a little explanation of what it is. First, it's a developmental disorder. This means that every adult with psychopathic traits started out as a child with psychopathic traits. The inverse is not always true. So some children look as though they have psychopathic traits and then go on to improve a lot over time for reasons that we don't really understand. But it is relatively persistent across the lifespan. It's also highly heritable. The heritability coefficients may be 0.5 or 0.6, which means that a huge chunk of the variation on psychopathic traits is attributable to genetic factors. It emerges early in development, which is not surprising given how heritable it is. And the traits that characterize it are features including a fearless temperament, so being relatively underreactive to threats and punishment. And the hallmark of psychopathy is reduced prosocial emotions like guilt and remorse and care, which are sometimes referred to as callous unemotional traits. And I'll use callous unemotional traits often to refer to the key personality features of psychopathy. And one important thing to know is that it's not like there's people who are psychopathic over here and then just the rest of us are regular. That's not true for almost any variable that I've ever studied in psychology. Instead, psychopathic traits are distributed continuously throughout the population, although not normally, which we'll get to later. Okay, and one thing I often get questions about is whether people who are psychopathic are always violent. They're not. Most people who are psychopathic are capable of violence because they don't care about other people. So if violence is the best route to get what they want, well, that's fine. But there's plenty of people who are highly psychopathic for whom violence is not their preferred method of getting what they want. Okay, so one of the many interesting questions about children and adults who have psychopathic traits is why, right? Why do they not care about other people? And I'm going to tell you right now, we don't exactly know yet. Psychopathy research is way behind research on disorders like autism and anxiety in children, in part because way too few resources have been devoted to studying it. However, we are making some progress. During my postdoctoral work, I started conducting research aimed at answering this question. And what I and others have found is that people who have psychopathic traits specifically struggle to recognize other people's fear. And again, only their fear. They have this very specific deficit in empathic accuracy. And this had been suspected for a while in people who study psychopathy. There are some amazing stories out there. For instance, one from my colleague Essie Whiting in the UK, who is testing a group of psychopathic inmates, adults in a prison there. And she was looking at their facial expression recognition, and one of the psychopathic inmates she was testing missed every single fearful expression they showed him, every single one, which is bad performance, even for somebody who's psychopathic. And he knew he was doing badly because he got to the very last expression in the set, the fearful expression. And he said, you know, I don't know what that expression is called, but I know that's what people look like right before you stab them. So think about that, right? He he recognized the expression in the sense that it looked familiar to him. He's like, yes, I've seen that face before. And he could even say that he'd seen that expression before in circumstances where people thought that they were about to die. But even so, he couldn't link the appearance of these, not subtle fearful facial expressions to the emotion fear. So that is a really profound emotional and empathic deficit that I think really gets to the core of what's wrong with a lot of people who are psychopathic. Obviously, it's just an anecdote, but the results of two meta-analyses that were conducted by myself and my advisor, James Blair, at the time, and then also Amy Dalal and her colleagues, found that what the study suggested is borne out empirically. And again, simply recognizing somebody else's emotional state, this person's afraid, is maybe the very most fundamental form of empathy. And the perception at the moment is that because people who are psychopathic don't experience fear strongly themselves, again, this comes back to the definition of psychopathy, they struggle to understand the same emotion in other people, right? And this is what's neat about this, the way these variables are related, is it's consistent with the theory of emotion recognition that is highly simulation based, right? We recognize other people's feelings by attempting to simulate that same state in ourselves. And if something is wrong with the neural architecture that enables us to experience that state, we have trouble detecting it and understanding it in others as well. Now, we do know something about the neural basis of these deficits in psychopathy. For example, in 2008, my group at the National Institute of Mental Health was the first to show that psychopathic adolescents exhibit reduced activity in the amygdala when they're looking at others' fearful expressions. And we found this pattern only for fearful expressions. And we observed it both relative to kids who were healthy and to kids who had only ADHD. And then in 2014, we found a linear decrease in amygdala responses to fear only as psychopathic traits increase, and that low amygdala responses to fear mediate the relationship between psychopathy and the kind of aggression that is most characteristic of psychopathy, which is instrumental or proactive aggression. Reactive aggression is super common across lots of different populations, including, for example, toddlers. I know of once I speak. But proactive aggression is relatively rare. And again, that's aggression that is aimed at achieving some sort of an instrumental goal for yourself. It's a much more callous form of aggression. It's sort of cold and calculated. And the only population in which it's known that proactive aggression is elevated is people who are psychopathic. And so again, what we found is that reduced amygdala responses to other people's expressions of fear mediates the relationship between psychopathy and this proactive aggression. Which suggests the possibility that it represents kind of a biomarker potentially for psychopathy, although that's very preliminary. And then finally, my student Elise Cardinale found that people who were psychopathic show reduced amygdala responses to written statements that would cause fear. And that's interesting because it suggests that this pattern of responding is stimulus independent. Right, you see that people who are psychopathic show amygdala deficits when they're just imagining somebody else feeling afraid. It has nothing to do with the specific appearance of a fearful expression or just visual processing. So these effects almost certainly reflect gross structural abnormalities in the amygdala. And we have found that in a number of studies as well. These are data from a study of 80 adolescents whose structural brain images we analyzed and found a very strong and specific relationship between the severity of their psychopathic traits and amygdala volume, with the most psychopathic kids having amygdalas that were something like 30% smaller than the kids who were least psychopathic. And then we've also found similar patterns in community samples. This is a community sample of adults who were assessed using a self-report psychopathy measure. And once again, increased psychopathy was linked to reduced amygdala volume. Okay, so we understand roughly why psychopathic children and adults experience fear weakly. There seem to be clear developmental anomalies in the amygdala. This also helps us understand why they have trouble empathizing with other people's fear, because if you don't experience a state strongly, it's difficult to understand it in other people. That just seems clear intuitively. But why would this necessarily be related to uncaring behavior, right? Why would empathic responses to other people's distress ever be related to care? And this is incredibly important to consider because these are two distinct processes, right? Understanding somebody else's internal emotional state wouldn't necessarily result in your having an increased desire to care for them. So this is the really, I don't know, alchemical transformation almost between empathy and care that I'm most interested in trying to understand. Okay. To try to answer it, let's take a moment to consider the internal structure of the amygdala. And I won't do much of internal structure of the amygdala. So you may be familiar with the very basic pathway by which amygdala turns inputs about threat into fear-related behaviors, right? The information goes into what's called the basolateral nucleus, gets transmitted to the central nucleus, and then the central nucleus tells the rest of the brain to generate fear behaviors like freezing and fleeing and escape through structures like the periaqueductal gray and the hypothalamus. For some time, the same pathway was thought to mediate responses to other people's fear, which allows for a simulation of that emotion via exactly the same pathways. And so for a long time, it was assumed that thus the response to other people's fear should also be, by default, freezing and fleeing and flight, right? Because if you get this amygdala response to other people's fear, wouldn't it just do the same thing? The issue is we often know, thanks to Batson, thanks to real life, like, people who rescue people, like the guy who rescued me, that's not what people do to the sight of others who are in distress. So the question is, what would shift the behavioral trajectory away from self-preservative behaviors like freezing and fleeing towards care? We have a little bit of understanding of this thanks to the animal literature. The key seems to be a population of, oh, sorry, I went too far, of oxytocinergic cells in the central nucleus of the amygdala that receive input from the basolateral nucleus. And you may know that oxytocin is a hormone that evolved to support parental care, specifically in mammals. It's produced only in mammals. In fact, there are analogs of oxytocin in other kinds of species, but oxytocin is a mammalian hormone. We also know that if a mammalian parent whose offspring are young and vulnerable and need their help, detects that their offspring are under threat via some sort of empathic simulation in the amygdala, they cannot run away, right? That is not the way that you get your babies to survive until adulthood. Instead, oxytocin produced in response to offspring cues seems to inhibit self-preservative fear via this pathway and motivates active care instead. So here's footage from one recent study, and there's no sound in the study, so I'll just play it, demonstrating how this effect looks. So in this study, rats were alone and they were conditioned to fear peppermint using foot shock, right? And they use only female rats in the study. Actually, I'm going to take you through the graphs first before I play the rest of the video. Okay. And then after the rats were trained to fear the smell of peppermint, the rats were then tested again on their responses, either alone or with their pups. And what the researchers found is that dams who were alone when they were tested on their responses to the scary smell of peppermint would freeze when they smelled the scary smell. And again, that's what rats do when they're afraid. And that is what you can see in the light gray bars here. However, when they were tested with their pups instead, what the researchers found is that instead of freezing in response to the scary smell, they would actively move toward the threat. In some cases, trying to even block the tube that the smell was coming in from. However, even dams who had pups would revert to freezing. So this is how much time they spent freezing, if the researchers administered an oxytocin antagonist to the amygdala, which very clearly demonstrates the role of oxytocin in the amygdala in switching, and I think of it kind of like a train switching tracks in a rail yard, in switching from away from self-preservative fear behavior to instead other protecting altruistic behavior. And again, this is important because we believe that parental care in mammals provides the root of most care-based altruism in general. And given the very highly conserved nature of oxytocin in the mammalian brain, And given very strong evidence that all care-based altruism emerges from networks that support parental care, it may be the case that altruism relies on a process like this in humans in response to threat or fear in others. Now I will, as promised, show you the video of these rats. Okay, so you can see that the dams alone predominantly freeze, and they're all experiencing exactly the same condition of the peppermint being piped in. Whereas the dams who had pups with them either spent their time retrieving their pups to the nest and huddling over them, or trying to block the tube the smell was coming in from, depending on the age of their pups. That's also very interesting, because it suggests that altruistic responding, even in a rat, is not a dumb sort of unnuanced process, right? Even rats can adjust their altruistic caring behavior to things like the age and the mobility of their pups. Okay. Based on what we've seen in studies like this one, what we think is that variation in human care and altruism may similarly reflect variation in the structure and function of these same systems, with psychopathic deficits in care reflecting amygdala abnormalities and probably low oxytocin that prevent people with these traits from accurately interpreting when others are in distress and or being motivated to help, which means that high psychopathy individuals sort of anchor one end of what you could consider a caring continuum. Now, the other end may be anchored by sort of a mirror image population of people who, instead of being highly antisocial, are highly pro-social and show heightened care and altruism to other people's distress and suffering. So if this is true, right, if extreme forms of altruism reflect a sort of anti-psychopathy, what would we expect to find in highly altruistic populations? Presumably that highly altruistic people should show better sensitivity to others' distress, in particular their fear, stronger amygdala responses to others' distress, in particular their fear. And I will get to the question later, and I know many of you may be thinking of it as like, why fear in particular? Why not pain or sadness? The short version of the answer for now is just empirically that's true. We've looked at responses to pain and sadness in the various populations we study, and the way that people respond to these other distress cues just doesn't seem to correspond as strongly to individual differences in care and compassion. And why that is, I'll get to in a little bit. Okay, and finally, we would also suggest that people who are more altruistic would show larger amygdalas as well, that may support their more altruistic responses. So my lab has spent the last 10 years now investigating exactly this question by focusing mostly on one particular population of very altruistic individuals, people like Angela Quazzo here, who have donated one of their own kidneys to a stranger. I don't know how much you know about what's called non-directed or altruistic kidney donation, but in order to donate your kidney to a stranger, you normally need to undergo weeks or sometimes months of testing, often very elaborate testing, followed by a usually quite painful and definitely not risk-free surgery. The risk of having a very serious complication and potentially dying from donating a kidney to a stranger is estimated to be about 1 in 3,000. Right, so that's not high, but just for comparison's sake, it's higher than the risk of somebody who is in their 20s dying from catching coronavirus, and it's higher than the risk of dying from skydiving. And you need to undergo weeks of recovery after the surgery, often at some cost to the donor, who, if the donation is non-directed, may never meet the person that they donated their kidney to. And sometimes this is true. Sometimes the donors never meet their recipients. And so, although I think people are becoming more familiar with the phenomenon of altruistic kidney donation, it's still the case that a lot of people who hear about donations like these absolutely cannot fathom what would motivate somebody to donate a kidney to a stranger. For the most part, people have tried in the past to understand why somebody would donate a kidney to a stranger by asking people who have done so, which is a great first step. We have too. I'm a good social psychologist. So I always want to know how people understand and explain their own behavior. And the first thing I want to emphasize is that people who donate kidneys to strangers give a variety of explanations about why they donate. And the risk of showing one video is that it might present the perception that kidney donors are homogenous when they're really not. But this is a reasonably representative example because, and you'll see this is what Harold emphasizes that most explanations about donating kidneys to strangers boil down to some variation of, I wanted to help somebody who was suffering, right? Helping somebody was the right thing to do, or even the obvious thing to do. And just as preface in this video, Harold is talking to my graduate student, Elise Cardinale, who is interviewing him, and I'm mostly laughing in the background. Oops. No. There it is. Why don't you think more people donate like this?
Unaware, ignorance, and not ignorance as in stupid, but ignorance as in not asking the right questions or not having the right dominoes fall at the right time. My favorite part is people say, oh, I could never do that. Oh, right. That's bullshit. That's absolutely bullshit, because I'll go through a series of questions. Would you give to your mother to save her life? And of course, 99, I always write this, I'll write 4 letters out on my hand. Okay, would you give to your mom? Would you give to your mom if she were dying?
Yes.
Why?
Because she's my mom.
Stop. That's the 4 letters I write down. BS, because she's my mom, is what everybody says. It's universal. Okay, so we got that. So you would never do what I do, but you do it for your mom. Okay, how about your sister or your brother? And I extend it. How about your best friend that's not related? How about your teacher or your boss? She's not even looking at you. She can't see you. If she was going to die next week and you're the only person, don't say anything out loud, but you think to yourself, really, she's going to die? So you start weighing what's priority. Yes, my rent is due. This is priority. This is health. This is life and death situations. And so people quickly go, I could never do that. And I just don't believe that, because your life's not been thrown into a situation that makes you make these kinds of decisions. So again, I keep coming back to my favorite part is, I think we all are capable of doing this. It's easy to say no, but when you're faced with a situation, yes, I raise my hand and look for the situation, but I know why I did that. But when push comes to shove, she very well might, or somebody in your circle might do that, because they don't want you to die. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
So again, the explanation that Harold gives in some ways, as he says, pretty simple. He's like, this person's going to die. Otherwise, if I don't give them my kidney, and I'll probably be fine. Like it's almost like he doesn't really see what there is to explain, which, I mean, when he puts it that way, it's pretty obvious. And yet clearly there is something to explain, because it's such a non-normative thing to do. It's such a non-normative decision to make. And most people, even if you give them that same information, wouldn't make the same decision. And so Harold's explanation, I think, is very important, but there's clearly more to the story than he's able to tell us. So we wanted to get a fuller picture and test our hypothesis that extraordinary altruism may sort of represent a kind of anti-psychopathy. And so to do this, we brought in 19 altruistic kidney donors to Georgetown from all over the country for MRI scanning. And we compared them to 20 controls that we recruited just from the DC area, who are matched with the kidney donors in terms of their gender and their race and their handedness and their age and their IQ and their education level and everything we could think of. I should mention that the self-report measures that we collected from donors and controls revealed not very many group differences. We didn't see any group differences in personality as measured by a Big 5 test. We didn't see any differences, at least in this sample, on self-reported empathy, although in bigger samples, we do see differences in empathic concern. No differences in reported attachment style, theory of mind. The only self-report measure that showed a difference between the groups, again, this was a small sample, was a measure of psychopathy. And the altruistic kidney donors had lower levels of one of the major factors of the psychopathy scale than controls. So how about our neural measures? The first scan that we ran directly replicated the task that we used to show reduced amygdala activity in children who were psychopathic. And as we predicted, and the opposite of people who are psychopathic, people who are altruistic show increased activity in the right amygdala in response to fearful expressions relative to controls, and only in response to fear. We don't see any similar pattern in response to angry expressions. And we think that this enhanced activation may support better recognition of fear, because when we ran an emotion recognition task outside the scanner, we found that the increased amygdala responses to fear predicted better recognition of fear outside the scanner. And overall, the altruists were relatively better at recognizing fear relative to controls as well, whereas again, the same was not true for anger, which they were actually less sensitive to. This actually makes sense. We know that being very sensitive to other people's anger is associated with hostile personality traits. It's better to be a little bit blind to when others are mad. And it seems that people who are altruistic maybe just a little bit. But again, what they have is higher sensitivity to this expression, fear, that we know elicits concern and care in people who see it. And just as the deficits we saw in psychopathy seem to reflect anatomical differences, the same is true in altruists. Structural brain analyses found that in altruists, the right amygdala had about 8% more gray matter than in the controls, whereas we found no similar differences in nearby structures like hippocampus and caudate. And these amygdala differences persisted even after we controlled for the fact that the altruists also had bigger brains overall, which I don't have a great explanation for. But together, these findings, I think, are pretty clear evidence that extraordinary altruism may result from something like an anti-psychopathic brain. I also think, coming back to one of the questions I started out with, is that this is very strong evidence against the idea that the main explanation for altruism for strangers that's costly, right, that we can't explain through kin selection, we can't explain through reciprocity, that when it's anonymous, you can't explain through reputation enhancement. What people who are just dead set in believing that the only possible motivations that humans have are selfish will come back to is mood enhancement. They're like, well, it must be that they wanted to just feel better about themselves. But that explanation that altruism is about mood enhancement would never predict this data set, right? The only explanation that makes sense in light of this very particular pattern of data is that altruists are generally more capable of care and compassion than the average person, because otherwise they wouldn't look exactly the opposite of people who are psychopathic. So these findings were super exciting, but they did leave a lot of questions unanswered. A really big one relates to empathy. So heightened amygdala responses to other people's fear may reflect better empathic responding, but that's not the only explanation because the amygdala does a lot of different things. Our more recent research has aimed to more explicitly test whether altruists do in fact show heightened empathic responding to other people's distress. And the most stringent test of empathic responding requires measuring brain activity while a participant experiences and observes another person undergoing identical distressing experiences. And then we can see if the brain responds in exactly the same way in both types of trials, right? When you're experiencing, for example, pain and watching somebody else experience pain. And if we do see similar patterns of brain activity, that would suggest true self-other mapping on the neural level. And so we designed a paradigm in which during scanning, 25 altruists and 27 match control participants experienced intense but not harmful pressure pain using this device called a thumbnail smasher during brain scanning. And the pain occurred following a brief anticipatory period, which we considered the fearful anticipation epoch. And this allowed us to distinguish between responses to pain and responses to fear. And each trial type was cued by a unique tone. Participants also watched via a live video feed from the scanner as a stranger who they briefly met underwent identical epochs of anticipation and experience of pressure pain. And then we conducted conservative conjunction null analyses and found that controls, so just regular people, show some evidence of empathic self-other mapping, meaning overlapping activation during both the pain trials and the anticipation or the fear trials, including in regions like the right insula that we know play an important part in empathy. But in the altruists, self-other mapping of both pain and fear was much more robust. Such that, for example, in the left anterior insula, we found significant positive associations between activation during the self-pain and the other pain trials in the altruists, but not in the controls. And note that this pattern was completely unrelated to self-reported empathy. It's just one of the many reasons that I always caution people against interpreting the results of self-report empathy scales as being empathy. What we're seeing in the brain in this study, that's empathy, right? The brain is actually mapping other people's experiences onto your own. Self-reported empathy is your best effort to try to reflect on your own empathic processes, and people are not always very accurate at doing so. What the empathic responses that we measured were associated with were the altruist increased reports of connectedness with strangers, including their study partners, on a scale that I love called the inclusion of other in the self scale, or the IOS. It's super easy to administer. And this suggests that not only are altruists more empathic, they view even strangers as viable targets of empathy, as if they were people that were close to them. We next wanted to see whether the patterns we observed truly reflect similar computational processes occurring in these regions using an approach called MVPA. And we found that indeed the voxel level pattern of activity in the altruist looks more similar when altruists are experiencing and observing another person's pain or fear. These are data for the fearful anticipation periods, but they look similar. And you can see that there's much more similar patterns across the self-other trials for altruists, whose data are on the right as compared to the controls on the left. Maybe even more interesting to me was that when we looked at the last block of the task, when participants were explicitly asked to empathize with their partner before scanning started, we found that greater self-other mapping in altruists persisted in regions of dorsal anterior cingulate cortex in particular. And this suggests that greater empathic resonance in altruists, self-other mapping, is not just about the controls not bothering and the altruist just doing it. Because even when we tell everybody, please try to empathize, the altruists are still doing it better. But we only found this pattern when people were observing others experiencing fear, not pain. We didn't find any pain group differences after the empathy instructions. And finally, we also observed stronger connectivity between the insula and the amygdala in the altruist during the task, which suggests that the amygdala is playing a role in the patterns of responses that we're seeing. Let me see. I think I'm going to skip the next study, which suggests the possibility of an oxytocinergic response, because we do see, and I'll just tell you briefly, in altruists, stronger connections between the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray in altruists when they are subliminally primed with fearful facial expressions relative to controls, and because we know that oxytocin plays a key role in the parental care activity in the amygdala and periaqueductal gray and the connections between them, this is very indirect evidence for the possibility that these oxytocinergic parental care circuits in the brain are driving the patterns that we see in extraordinary altruists. But it's very, very indirect evidence, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that one. I have just a couple minutes left, so I think I'm just going to highlight one of these questions, which I alluded to earlier. These studies do help us answer a number of questions about the altruistic brain, but they leave other questions very open, including why fear, right? Why is fear such an important emotion for understanding individual differences in care and compassion? There are a few possible reasons. Another question is, why are altruists in particular more responsive to the fear and distress of strangers, right? Because you can imagine being a more empathic person, but it being limited to people very close to yourself. And what's interesting about altruists is that their care and compassion seems to be particularly exerted towards strangers. And then finally, can altruism be increased? All right, let's go to the first question first. Why fear? So one possible reason is that fearful expressions pretty consistently elicit care and concern from people who see them, right? So this is how much care people report following, I should emphasize, a subliminal fearful expression prime in our task. And then we have people read just a short vignette about somebody in very mild distress. When we have subliminally primed people with fearful expressions before they read the vignette, they report even more care and compassion for this person that they read about. So it makes sense that individual differences in sensitivity to these expressions would be linked to variation in care. One reason they elicit care may be in part because these expressions are perceived as affiliative. Fearful expressions are perceived as indicating a desire for social connection. And in fact, they're perceived as nearly as affiliative as happy expressions, which is a really important thing to understand, because it helps us understand why fearful expressions elicit behavioral approach in people who perceive them. This is, by the way, in opposition to the very common, but I think mistaken idea that fearful expressions are primarily threat cues, right? That if you see a fearful expression, it signals a threat and you want to escape. We know that can't be true. And one of the reasons is that in these approach avoidance tasks where we run, where people are asked to pull or push a lever away from them or pull it toward them, which indexes approach and avoidance motivation, people predominantly indicate an approach response to fear, which means they can pull the bar faster when they see a fearful expression than they can push it away from them, which suggests that these expressions may be appetitive rather than aversive. We also found that in typical samples, the more caring somebody's personality is, the more they respond to fear with approach, with this tendency being the most obvious in extraordinary altruists who respond much more strongly with approach to fear than controls do. And you can see here, we don't see any similar response for pain, right? Pain is a distress cue. It does elicit empathic responses, but for some reason, there are the key ingredients of a painful facial expression just don't elicit this strong approach response the same way that fear does. Now, I do think we know the reason for this, why fearful expressions elicit approach, especially if they elicit empathic fear. And the key to the whole thing may be the basic appearance of fearful facial expressions. So several studies I've conducted now indicate that fearful expressions make a person's face look more infantile, right? A fearful expression mimics the appearance of an infantile face with the high eyebrows and the large eyes and the sort of overall rounded appearance of the mouth and jaw. Consistent with the fact that fearful expressions, one of the main things they do is make you look infantile, is that in these approach avoidance tasks we ran, we find very similar patterns of approach to infant faces as we find to fearful faces. And this is a huge important clue about care, that this expression that consistently elicits care from others and that even may serve in terms of the ability to recognize it as a biomarker for care resembles an infant face. Because this dovetails really nicely with this idea that in mammals, the capacity for all forms of care emerged out of ancient systems that support parenting, care for infants. And so my running hypothesis at the moment is that fearful expressions' infantile appearance may stimulate oxytocin production in people who see them. And again, I don't have any direct data to support that, but I think the indirect data are very consistent with them because other infant cues do elicit oxytocin. And then when that oxytocin arrives in the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala, which it does, there's direct connections between oxytocin cells and the basolateral nucleus. It helps switch the train and the rail yard away from self-preservative fear behaviors towards toward other protective care. All right, I think I may wrap up there. And maybe I will, and I don't know how easily I can navigate from here to my thank you slides, but I will give them before we end. But maybe I'll just stop and see if anybody has any questions at this point.
Yeah, anybody who has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose questions for Dr. Marsh. And we'll do our best to take them in order received. Well, I will say while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I think it's particularly interesting to consider this idea of the desire for social connection being perceived from fear expressions, and be very interested to hear like the last bullet point especially. So thinking about this caring continuum and how we can encourage people to approach rather than avoid empathic situations. I think in this broader questions about the degree to which one's position on the continuum is fixed versus flexible, I think is quite interesting.
Why don't I jump to that? I can give just a couple minutes on that. I can very briefly also say that when it comes to the question of why strangers, we have a pretty simple answer to that. It seems to be that the other key hallmark of the altruists that we've studied, in addition to their being more sensitive to other people's fear, is that they show what are called low rates of social discounting. And you're probably familiar with temporal discounting. It's sort of delay of gratification. The value of a reward doesn't decline even if you're going to get it in a long time, if you're low on temporal discounting. Social discounting means that the value of a reward doesn't decline much if you share it with others. And so in these tasks where we measure social discounting, we ask people, okay, you could either get this pot of resources, or you could opt to share and sacrifice some resources for yourself so another person could have the same amount as you. And most people are very interested in sharing with people who are very close to them. And we ask them this question about different possible social targets. So you're the person who is your closest social connection, or your next closest, or maybe your fifth closest, or maybe somebody who you barely know at all, right? Somebody who's sort of 100 spaces on the social axis out from you. And we ask them to specify real people who these might refer to. And what we find is that pretty much everybody who tests social discounting, when they're looking at healthy controls, you see a very sharp drop off in how much people want to share resources with others when those others are strangers. So again, most people will share a lot of resources with people close to them and not a lot with controls. And in our studies of altruistic kidney donors, this is the biggest behavioral effect we found in all of our tests of the kidney donors, is that they have a very flat social discounting curve. They're equally willing to share with anybody, whether they're close to them or not. And this is research I'm really excited about. We've recently conducted a big study, the only one to my knowledge ever, looking at lots of different features of different groups of real world extraordinary altruists, including liver donors. And that's even more dangerous than donating a kidney. Both directed and non-directed kidney donors, humanitarian aid workers, like people who work for Doctors Without Borders, and heroic rescuers, and bone marrow donors. And we find that they all show flatter social discounting curves than controls. And the degree to which they value the welfare of strangers seems to be linked to how extraordinary their behavior is. When it comes to understanding whether altruism can be increased, the best evidence for that is that it is increasing. When you look around the world at behaviors like blood donation and marrow donation and charitable giving and things, you tend to see upward trajectories over time, which makes it very clear that altruism can be increased. When we've looked at geographic variables that predict variation in altruism across populations, the variable that we have found is the best predictor of differences in altruism is well-being. When people report that they're thriving, and even this is after you just account for all sorts of other demographic variables, wealth and education and health-related variables and gender and race, and I mean, you name it. When people say that they're thriving, they engage in the most altruistic behavior. And we found this for altruistic kidney donation. We've also found it for charitable donations, volunteering, everyday helping, blood donation, marrow donation, kidney donation, how people treat non-human animals. And then of course, when we combine them all together, we find there's a really strong relationship between thriving and altruism. And this suggests that when people are doing well in their lives, when they feel like life is going well for them, they feel a sense of optimism and a sense of purpose and a sense of connectedness to people around them, altruism tends to increase, which is a good thing to know, because it suggests that there's no inherent conflict between doing well and doing good. Maybe I'll now jump to my thanks slides. All right.
Well, thanks. That was really helpful and really, really cool data. That's really exciting to see that come out at some point soon. And we have had, and that's clarifying too. I think it's fascinating to think about the overlap between different kinds of motivators and how that might shape your position on the continuum.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a number of questions roll in. Yeah, a lot of good ones. One of them is from actually one of my grad students, Julian, who's asking about amygdala lesions. So I think he's referring to some work looking at amygdala lesions and like approach biases towards strangers and like increased fearlessness. And just, I think he's asking in some cases, like where you see that happening and costly helping of complete strangers, given your expertise on the amygdala and psychopathy, how do you see that lesion work fitting into this?
That's a very well-informed question. That's somebody who clearly knows this literature well. So there are really interesting studies out there with people who have had severe lesions to the amygdala, frequently people who have a disorder called Urbach-Wichthe that results in, it's a genetic disorder that results in calcification of the amygdala, overdevelopment, with the most famous Urbach-Wichthe patient being SM. Right, and so we know that SM shares some features with people who are psychopathic, right? They are similarly impaired in their inability to recognize other people's fearful facial expressions. I very briefly mentioned a task when I was talking about psychopathy that we have created called the EAST. We test whether people can recognize whether different statements would elicit one of a number of emotions, and people who are psychopathic are impaired in recognizing that a statement like, I could hurt you if I wanted to. You can't protect yourself from me, like not subtle statements. Most people say, yes, that would cause somebody to feel fear. People who are psychopathic are very confused with those statements. They're like, would they be mad? Would they be sad? And we've seen that being able to answer these questions also relies on the amygdala. Recently, we had the opportunity to administer this same task to SM, which was a dream come true. It was, I was very gushy and sort of starstruck about the whole thing. We didn't get to meet her, of course, because that's not allowed, but we did, we do have her data. And we found that she's also impaired in this task. She can't recognize those fear eliciting statements. And so it's clear that that's a common thread. Anybody with a disordered amygdala has difficulty generating an internal representation of fear, period. And I know that there's a lot of talk out there about how the amygdala is just a general salience detector. And to some extent, that's true. That's what the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala does. But you can experience emotions other than fear just fine without an amygdala, which suggests that the amygdala is not essential for emotions like reward seeking, disgust, anger, etc. But it is essential for fear because of the role the central nucleus plays in that. Okay, but your key question is, do you see these same empathic, sort of pro-social moral deficits in somebody like SM? And the answer is very clearly no. So people have tested her on measures of psychopathy, and she does not have psychopathic traits. People who interact with her comment how incredibly friendly she is, right? She does a lot of close social approach, although that is also something you see in psychopathy, where people who are highly psychopathic maintain shorter interpersonal distance. And we actually have some data we just recently collected. So this is still in prep, showing that that's true even now when close social distances are potentially fatal. The difference is, we think, between people who are psychopathic and SM when it comes to moral phenomenon is developmental. And so people who are psychopathic have amygdalas that are impaired, we think, from the get-go. I mean, there are problems emerging even before they're born. And so the reason this is important is because from work done in labs like NIM Tottenham's, we know that signals that from the amygdala play a really important role wiring up the rest of the brain, in particular the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in a lot of sort of, balancing out different options, making decisions. And what seems to be the case is that if you're not getting appropriate input from the amygdala during childhood, in the period leading up to adolescence, it ends up, I don't want to say permanently, but there's a persistent effect on your moral cognition, because the whole rest of the brain's development has been affected by that lack of amygdala input. And so that seems to create the connection between low sort of sensitivity to fear and poor moral responses to the idea of causing other people harm and distress. The difference with SM is that she didn't have her amygdala, as far as we know, was not significantly atrophied until sometime in adolescence. So at some point in childhood, she did have an intact amygdala. And as best we can tell, that is probably why her sense of morality, of why it's not okay to cause other people distress, remains intact.
Great, thank you. That was fantastic. That was really helpful, and there's a lot of really fascinating data out there to speak to this. We have 3 more questions. I think that in the interest of time, probably, shoot, 4 more questions. Yeah, no, Julian just said thank you. So it's kind of a follow-up. So yeah, other questions. One of them from Carly is about, it's a question more about the extraordinary altruism effects. Are they more empathetic towards loved ones who exhibit signs of depression than are non-altruistic individuals?
A good question. We haven't seen any differences in how they respond to sadness. Although I will say we haven't tested it a lot. And I also know depression is not exactly the same thing as sadness. People who are very altruistic do seem a little bit susceptible themselves to some mood and anxiety issues. And I think that's partly because they are very emotionally reactive people. One of the messages I hope you take away from this talk is that there's a big difference between being fearless and being brave. I would, actually I can, here's my, oh, was it still there? There it is. That altruists are what I would consider brave, right? They're people who are perfectly capable of experiencing emotions like fear and distress and suffering. But they value other people's welfare so highly that they're willing to overcome fear for the self in order to help others. Whether they're more sensitive to the distress or suffering of close others is not something we've spent a lot of time looking at. We're doing a discounting paradigm now where we're asking them to make choices about helping close others versus more distant others. And it wouldn't tell us much about depression in particular. It would just tell us about how much you value the welfare of these different people. I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking back now, I've only got anecdotes now that I can give you, but I will say that one of the interesting things we've observed is that the people who usually don't want are unenthusiastic about kidney donation are the parents, the mothers, the spouses of the potential donor. Moms do not want their kids donating kidneys to strangers in general. I'm sure there are exceptions. Spouses do not want their partners donating a kidney to a stranger. And what's been interesting is that most altruistic kidney donors are like, okay, fine, you know, this might be upsetting you, but I'm still going to do it. And that suggests what is consistent with our discounting data, which is that they don't favor the emotions of their loved ones over those of strangers as much as most people do, right? Most people really care about a relatively small circle of people. And you know, the extent to which other people's welfare can compete drops off dramatically. And I think with the strangers, there's just a compression of that slope. It's not that they don't care more about family than others, but it's just less. And you know, P.S. This is exactly what all the moral philosophers and the Buddhists and everything tell us we should do: is expand our circle of compassion. But it's interesting seeing what kinds of conflicts that can create within a family. You know, Buddhist monks like often do not have families, and it's interesting to see the ways that plays out in real life.
Yeah, that's great. That reminds me, reminds me of a paper by Leanne Young and Ryan McManus that I think just came out in Psych Science,
Yep.
looking at exactly, I mean, different kinds of paradigms, but this trade-off between favoring kin versus stranger and how others perceive it. That actually leads to, there are two more quick questions. One is by one of my other grad students, Eliana, who was really intrigued by your data, and she was thinking about perceptions of extraordinary altruism.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any measures assessing perceptions of stigma toward like the do-gooder status, and whether that discourages their prosociality? And this is, I think she's asking this from the perspective of the extraordinary altruists. She referenced, Eliana's mentioning Larissa McFarquhar's book, Strangers Drowning, that talks about how people sometimes stigmatize others who they perceive to be pro-social in a way that's seemingly outside the norm in some respect.
Yeah, we do have some very recent data we collected on how the average person perceives extreme altruists. I'm trying to remember whether we asked them any questions along the lines of how weird do you think this is, or how good do you think this is? I'm sure we do buried in there, but I don't have those analyses readily available. People are not that good at predicting what it is that makes very altruistic people different. So first of all, when we ask all these different populations of altruists to describe themselves, the way that other people imagine they differ from a typical person is not very accurate. Anecdotally, we hear from lots of people who have donated a kidney to a stranger that lots of people consider what they do strange or bizarre. My perception is that, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, that you know, the idea that extraordinary altruism results from reputation enhancement goals doesn't hold much water, because it really only enhances your reputation with a few people. A lot of other people are just kind of weirded out by the whole thing. And I think this results primarily from egocentric bias. You know, most of us assume that other people's internal mental states are mostly like our own, right? We use ourselves as a reference point for understanding other people. Which works fine for most things because of the normal curve, right? Most of us do sit comfortably in the middle of the normal distribution of most traits, as do most other people. And so we can use ourselves as a rough proxy. Where we can't do that very well is trying to explain people at the tails. And so this is one reason that people who are psychopathic freak people out. They're like, I just can't imagine not caring at all about making somebody else suffer, right? It's unfathomable to most people. But there's nothing inherently strange about finding psychopathy weird or kind of unsettling, right? It makes sense. But I think what's happening at the high end of the caring continuum is the same, right? Most people just cannot imagine being willing to give up one of their own kidneys to a stranger. More people can imagine that than you might think. It's not as strange as you might think. But a lot of people, right? Many people in the comfortable middle of the caring continuum just can't imagine it. And it kind of freaks them out, right? And so this is one of the reasons that people assume, that they must be crazy, right? That they must want some like creepy selfish goal that they're not supposed to want, like money. People use a lot of supernatural terms to refer to altruists, like saint and guardian angel. I think just because they're like, I can't imagine a human being wanting to feel this way. And what people are really mean is, I can't imagine feeling this way. I have nothing to explain it with. And it's freaking me out. I think that's where that comes from.
Thank you. We have one last quick question. And Eliana says thanks. One quick question. That is a nice feature of the Zoom discussion, to get immediate feedback from people. So the last question is about temperament. So basically, have you looked at temperament among the extreme altruist group? Are there differences? This is from Megan. Are there differences in fearful avoidant temperaments or exuberant approach temperaments compared to the control groups?
So in the sense of how we looked at anything that could tell us about their temperament in the sort of infant temperament sense, which I think is probably what that question is getting to. No, I mean, most of the altruists that we have studied have been middle-aged. The modal altruistic kidney donor is in their 50s. It's pretty rare even for somebody in their 20s or 30s to donate. Not never. The youngest donor that we have studied was, I believe, 19 when she donated. But that's pretty uncommon. And so, we don't have a lot of great direct evidence on anything related to childhood. We can ask people a little bit about their childhoods, but how accurately is the average 57-year-old going to be able to tell you what they were like when they were 2? I don't know. Just judging from other data on this topic, in general, kids who are more emotionally reactive do tend to show higher levels of empathy. We know that. A highly fearless disposition is a strong risk factor for developing callous unemotional traits. We know that too. The other key piece of the puzzle, probably the early childhood trait that is predictive, although there's not as much direct evidence on this, but I think what there is pretty good, is a strong sort of social orientation, being very interested in social beings, paying a lot of attention to social beings. And the issue with this kind of measurement is that it's hard to disambiguate the kind of low social attentiveness you see in autism, for example, which is not psychopathy, very different. And the low social attentiveness you see in psychopathy. I'm not an autism expert, but my sense is that they are different. But the difference is that the kids who have high psychopathic traits they seem to just find other people less rewarding, right? They don't get as much gratification out of mutual social interaction, out of making eye contact, out of all of those processes that help people form close bonds, because they don't develop close bonds. And again, this is the thing that's so hard to imagine. Like, what would it be like to not have an affiliation axis in your social life? But they just don't. Like, they don't care about some people more than other people. They don't care about anybody except themselves. And so all of the factors that we see early in childhood that suggest that children are finding affiliation highly rewarding, you don't see in high psychopathy kids. And so my guess is that good sensitive measures of affiliation and the degree to which you find affiliation rewarding would probably also be predictive of altruism. And I think what happens is that they tend to snowball, right? If you're a highly affiliative kid, you engage in more pro-social behavior, you get the reinforcement, the warm glow that does naturally result from helping other people, although it's not the intention, right? It's a foreseeable outcome, but it's not the goal. I think that's a really important distinction. And so you become more and more altruistic over time. And that's what most of the altruists we've worked with report, is that, they didn't start out donating a kidney. They started out being the kid who screamed at their parents to pull over when they saw an injured animal on the side of the road, or who sat with a kid nobody else would sit with. And they'd started donating blood as soon as they were able to donate blood, and that was awesome. So maybe they put themselves on the marrow registry and donated marrow or donated plasma. And by the time you've done all that, well, donating a kidney kind of seems like a natural next step.
Great, thanks. No, that's very helpful. We did have one more question, I think, from Sarah, but you need to enter your question through the Q&A chat. So, well, in the interest of, maybe it'll come out in a second. I don't know. In the interest of time, I know that we have the panel coming up at 1 p.m. And so if any of you have any remaining questions for Dr. Marsh, please, feel free to join us then and contribute your insights and thoughts there as well. My care instinct is also going. But yeah, I think, thank you very much for coming and giving a talk and telling us about your work. And for those of you who want to continue the conversation and think more about how empathy and care and altruism may have some implications for what's happening right now with the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it, please do join us at 1. It'll be Dr. Marsh, myself, Michael Poulin from last year's series, David DeSteno, and Paul Conway. And we'll be chatting. And if you have any questions, please do send them our way beforehand so that we can know what all of you find potentially most interesting about the intersection of those ideas. So thank you very much. And yeah, I guess that's it. So thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.